Hola, bon dia, buenos días. Començarem aquesta altra taula. Per mi és un honor participar en aquesta trobada. Jo soc Miquel Molina, soc director adjunt de La Vanguardia i escric normalment cada diumenge sobre temes de cultura i ciutats. I en el marc d'aquestes coses que escric, en sintonia amb algunes institucions i administracions, estic interessat, i per això m'agrada molt parlar en aquest àmbit, en què Barcelona es converteixi d'alguna manera en una de les capitals del debat sobre l'humanisme tecnològic o la tecnoètica. Aquí tenim diverses coses a favor, tenim centres d'investigació molt rellevants en àrees com la intel·ligència artificial, la robòtica, la fotònica o la supercomputació, entre altres. Tenim el Mobile World Congress, com sabeu, i tenim també una forta energia política important que es pot canalitzar de moltes maneres, i una d'elles és que Barcelona tingui aquest paper rellevant. Amb això coincidim, a banda del meu diari, com us deia, La Vanguardia, la Sindicatura de Greuges també està compromesa amb aquesta idea de convertir Barcelona en un referent, un dels referents mundials d'aquest debat, i també institucions com la Digital Future Society, l'Ajuntament, la Generalitat, el govern espanyol estan per aquest propòsit. Aleshores, avui el que parlarem en aquest debat és sobretot del marc legal sobre el que és aquesta realitat, aquest futur, com es deia, com s'ha dit molt bé a l'anterior xerrada, aquesta realitat que ja és passat, realitat i futur de la intel·ligència artificial. No cal a aquestes alçades, després de tots els debats que heu tingut des d'ahir, no cal que entrem en detall sobre de què parlem quan parlem dels avantatges de la intel·ligència artificial i quan parlem dels problemes que incorpora, dels riscos, les amenaces que incorpora la intel·ligència artificial. En aquest debat avui es planteja un repte important i interessant, com la Comissió Europea i la Unió Europea en general, els països membres, han de participar, han d'estar a l'alçada d'aquesta cursa tecnològica que hi ha al voltant de la intel·ligència artificial, evitar el risc que es creï un mercat fragmentat que deixi fora, que faci menys competitives les empreses europees, i al mateix temps mantenir aquests estàndards europeus, que són molt més alts que el d'altres economies avançades, estàndards europeus de garantia de drets als seus ciutadans. Per respondre a aquestes qüestions tenim aquí a la Martha Stickings, que és analista política i responsable de cooperació institucional en el Fundamental Rights Agency, una agència europea. Tenim la Geraldine Mattioli, que és assessora de la Comissaria Europea de Drets Humans. I tenim el Peter Bonner, que és jurista principal de l'Ombudsman Europeu. Teníem també a Gregor Strojin, que era el president del comitè ad hoc creat per la Comissió Europea per la intel·ligència artificial, però ha excusat la seva presència i ens ha enviat un vídeo amb la seva primera intervenció. Ho passarem primer perquè així ja entrem després amb el debat humà i passem primer el vídeo del Gregor Strojin que ens ha enviat com a la seva participació en aquest congrés.
Hello, and greetings from Slovenia. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be at the workshop in person to greet you in Barcelona, but I was supposed to fly through Venice airport, and due to the measures, due to the recent outbreak of coronavirus in northern Italy, this could cause some complications when I want to return, and also when I want to go to some European institutions, because they're limiting access for travelers to northern Italy. Be that as it may, I'm also relatively uncomfortable of speaking via video, not having the interactive possibility of discussing the matter with you. So I'm not sure what you have already heard on the artificial intelligence. I have looked at the agenda. It's very interesting, and I would have wished to have participated, but I hope I will be able to present the outline of what we are doing at the Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence at the Council of Europe, why we're doing it, and what we are trying to achieve by doing it. What are the expected outputs? I'm sure that my colleague Mario from the Spanish delegation will be able to answer some of the questions that you might have and to represent Cajay in my absence. So, currently, it seems that much of the global development in the field of artificial intelligence is based on self-regulation. Self-regulation, in turn, is based on trust. And trust has been breached a couple of times recently when it comes to artificial intelligence and its effect on human rights. We need to re-establish trust, also as a condition for a more willing and responsible use by the technology by the authorities, and through this, for the encouragement of further development of responsible and trustworthy technology and its applications that could enhance the benefits for the society. But what do we mean when we say regulation? Lack of regulation represents regulation by itself. We could substitute the word with policy or governance, or just limit it to legislation. But what is more important to take into consideration, we also need to understand the autonomous impact of market forces, social norms, and technology itself on the process. Not everything that is feasible from a technological perspective can be considered acceptable from a human rights perspective. Currently, many national, international, and supranational bodies are developing or assessing various types of regulatory mechanisms to address the issues posed by the emergence and proliferation of AI technologies. At the moment, there are more than 200 soft law instruments. Is the current legal framework adequate? Can non-binding documents such as recommendations and guidelines effectively protect the desired levels of human rights? There are some issues that are worth keeping in mind to achieve the most effective solutions that would adequately and appropriately balance the beneficial aspects of technological development with simultaneous protection of humans and the society from negative aspects, both intentional and inadvertent. Impacts that are contrary to the existing human rights standards already fall under the preventative responsibility of states. However, are they effectively addressed? Regulatory powers are primarily a competence of states, but in technologies and activities with significant extraterritorial or even global effects, common rules are desired in order to ensure clarity and to prevent a race to bottom by putting too much emphasis on technological possibilities. International and supranational organizations to which such work is often delegated can and do differ in their jurisdiction, competences, and mandate, and can produce documents and norms with different influence or binding strength, which is relevant, for example, to enforcement in individual cases. Council of Europe is one of the few that can produce legally binding instruments. Different approaches should not be considered in competition, but as complementary contributions to yet developing frameworks. For example, common definitions and classifications are most valuable to ensure clarity and potential legal certainty, and allow a common platform for assessment of risks and opportunities. Duplication, on the other hand, can cause confusion and potential divergence in implementation practices and should be avoided unless well substantiated. We are all probably familiar with the examples relating to criminal justice for assessment of offenders or recidivism, which have shown that bias in data used for training models is replicated and scaled when applied by the technology to real-life scenarios. Problems can also arise from algorithms themselves, either due to the work of designers and programmers or due to the nature of the decision-making process. This is probably the most AI-relevant aspect which still looks for an adequate solution. Black boxes not being transparent enough or not showing or not allowing adequate explainability and consequent legal scrutiny. Sometimes models are based on assumptions that have no or low scientific value, such as assessment of emotions based on image recognition. Sometimes such tools are used in a private setting, such as human resources for vetting candidates either for employment or for termination of employment. Sometimes it is also impossible to know if AI was used in the process at all. Obscurity can come on different levels. Other types of problems arise from unscrupulous use of technology without adequate risk or impact assessment, with facial recognition technology being one prominent example. It might be that there are legal instruments that can protect us, but the question then becomes whether they're effective enough, if they're responsive enough. Such were, for example, also findings regarding challenges to existing tort law regimes in a recent EU study on liability of artificial intelligence. And if you allow me, I'll just read an excerpt from this study. It says, "It is possible to apply existing liability regimes to emerging digital technologies. But in light of a number of challenges and due to the limitations of existing regimes, doing so may leave victims under or entirely uncompensated. The adequacy of existing liability rules may therefore be questionable, considering in particular that these rules were formulated decades or even centuries ago based on even older concepts and incorporating a primarily anthropocentric and monocausal model of inflicting harm." Another example for application of existing legal mechanisms was also made by a recent Dutch decision on the so-called Siri automated learning program, which was used by the Dutch authorities to predict which citizens are likely to commit some sort of welfare fraud. The ruling, which came out in the beginning of February, is landmark because it was based on the right to privacy that's set out by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The court found problematic the lack of transparency about how the algorithmic risk scoring system functioned and determined that the Siri legislation failed a balancing test in Article 8 of the European Convention, which requires that any social interest should be weighed against the violation of individuals' private life with a fair and reasonable balance required. The automated risk assessment system, however, failed this test in the court's view. It was a black box and as such not legal. Different stages of AI system lifecycle can produce different risks and implications, with various levels of severity, both in terms of actors as well as stakeholders. Also, the definition, the technology, the impacts, the use of the technology, they're all a moving target. Clear understanding of effects, impact, and risks required both classification and categorization of AI systems and applications, their continuous monitoring, and interdisciplinary assessment of findings. This can eventually lead to either verification, validation, certification. Human rights, impact, and risk assessment seem almost necessary and would require not only technical analysis, but also various humanistic knowledge and input. There are various options that can be applied, and it is clear that there cannot be one solution to fit it all. So how do we go about it? CAHAI, which is an acronym for Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, has been tasked by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe to prepare a feasibility study of a legal framework and its potential elements for design, development, and application of AI in the context of existing Council of Europe standards for protection of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. It held its first plenary in November 2019 and is expected to produce the feasibility study by the end of 2021. And if you'll just let me put the light back on. Okay. During the first stage of CAHAI, work is being done on identification of risks and opportunities of artificial intelligence, considering human rights standards, and on mapping of binding and non-binding instruments. The goal is to produce a comprehensive overview of the existing legal framework and an evaluation of its capabilities to address the most pressing effects. This can eventually lead to identification of gaps and areas which need to be addressed anew. Council of Europe has substantial mileage on the wider aspect of the subject. In addition to the European Convention on Human Rights, it is the home of the Convention 108 and 108 Plus, which are on data protection and are sometimes considered grandmothers of GDPR. And it's also home of the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. There are currently more than 40 other initiatives at the Council of Europe, including, for example, the recommendation of the Commissioner for Human Rights, who produced the document Unboxing AI, 10 Steps to Produce Human Rights. Also, CEPEJ, the Commission for Efficiency of Justice, was the first to adopt the ethical charter on the use of AI in the judicial systems in 2018. What could also be considered partially relevant and historically relevant, we have an example from 1964 with a convention that established the European Pharmacopoeia, which is an institution that verifies the suitability of medical products and procedures which are put on the European market. Prior to that, regulation of medical products was decentralized, and it was in the public health interest to establish such a mechanism. It might be so that this is the path that we also have to take with modern technologies, such as artificial intelligence. Of course, we're not dealing with a static product, such as tablets or pills or medical procedures. We're dealing with a dynamic system. But there are some aspects that are similar. For example, we are looking, does the system do what it says it does? Does it also do something else? What are its effects? What are its side effects? What are the indications? What are the counterindications? What we want to do is identify problematic artificial intelligence applications and effects from a perspective of ensuring respect for human rights, rule of law, and democracy. We want to identify the key values and principles which are arising in a bottom-up perspective from sectorial approaches and from ethical guidelines, and then from top-down fundamental rights, democracy, and rule of law requirements. There can be red lines which seem that should not be allowed to be crossed. For example, AI-powered mass surveillance, social scoring as we know it from certain parts of the globe, deep fakes and their effects on democracy, how do we address that? And most likely, prohibition or not allowing the discussion on legal personality of AI. And then we want to set down possible options of a Council of Europe legal framework by taking into consideration the contents, addressees, added value, and member states and multi-stakeholder expectations on various options that can be used. And these can be either an update of existing legally binding instruments, it could be a new convention, it could be a new framework convention, it could be soft law instruments such as recommendations, guidelines. It could also be other type of support to member states. We also need to look at possible complementarity between the horizontal transversal elements, which could be part of a convention type instrument, and the vertical sectorial work which could give rise to specific instruments of a different nature. Also, what is of crucial importance, the feasibility study will have to address operational mechanisms to ensure effectiveness of the legal framework. Work is done through a broad multi-stakeholder participation. In addition to 47 member states, we have a number of representatives from other bodies of Council of Europe, but also other countries that serve as observers to the Council of Europe, non-governmental organizations, civil law societies, and also from business. It is my opinion that it is important to build on the existing work, especially in terms of developing a comprehensive and mutually acceptable body of definitions and classifications. This is why we also include various international organizations as participants and observers. It is, however, too early to predict whether approaches will eventually converge and to what degree. But we should prevent distraction and we should prevent delay. We should prevent race to the bottom by, if nothing else, trying for too long. Or, on the other hand, if we only try to search a minimum consensus. This probably would not be enough for what are the challenges ahead. What is required in the long run when it comes to AI impact on human rights is, 1, acceptance of political responsibility for unregulated risks and impacts. Then, awareness of possible policy instruments. And 3, regulatory proportionality and agility when using them, which requires constant, continuous, and objective assessment of mechanisms' impact and effectiveness. So this is the broad outline of what we're trying to do at CAHAI. We're still at the early stages of the mapping exercise, but hopefully we will be able to contribute to the development of the field and to the protection of human rights, rule of law, and democracy. With this, I conclude my message to you, and I wish you very good work ahead of the workshop, and hopefully, as I said in the beginning, Mario from the Spanish delegation is there and will be able to answer some of the questions you might have. Bye.
Bé, pel format vídeo no l'hem pogut tallar perquè quedava malament allò de dir-li vagi acabant, no? No ens hagués sentit. Ha parlat 18 minuts, demano als nostres ponents que si poden es limitin als 10 minuts que havíem pactat. Tampoc li puc fer la contrapregunta que volia fer-li i passarem directament a Martha Stickins que ens expliqui la seva presentació.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you also to the organisers for inviting the Fundamental Rights Agency to participate in this important event. It's really a great pleasure to be here to be able to talk a bit about some of the work that we have been doing on artificial intelligence and the fundamental rights considerations that come into play as part of that discussion. Just a few brief words on the organisation that I work for. We are an independent agency of the European Union with a mandate to collect data and provide evidence and analysis to the EU institutions and the member states when they implement union law. Like everyone else, I think artificial intelligence and the broader digital agenda is an ever more important part of our work. And we have several initiatives that I'll tell you a little bit about where AI in particular is a focus. Before I go on, I should just say briefly that you heard from my introduction, we are an independent agency, so I can't speak to the European Union's position or the Commission's position, but what I'll focus on is some of our views from a fundamental rights perspective in terms of some of the main concerns and considerations in this discussion. To start with, it's perhaps useful to reflect quickly on what the current state of play is. We've heard from lots of the speakers already at this event that there are many different policy developments that are underway at the European level. And we see that fundamental rights considerations are coming into play as part of many of those discussions. There's far too many of these initiatives for me to mention, but it's perhaps worth highlighting a few which give an idea of how discussions around AI came onto the policy agenda. In 2017, the European Parliament adopted 2 resolutions which highlight the importance of big data, AI, and robotics, and also refer to the importance of fundamental rights. There were also Council conclusions in 2017, after which the European Commission published a communication on AI for Europe and set up the high-level expert group on AI that we've already heard a bit about. Both of these initiatives include a strong reference to fundamental rights, and one of our heads of unit is a member of the high-level group. Then, of course, most recently in February, there was the publication of the Commission's white paper on artificial intelligence, which we've already heard quite a bit about. But it's worth also recalling that that was just one element of a broader package of documents that was released in February. There was also a report on liability issues, there was a European data strategy, and a broader digital strategy. And it's useful, I think, to put the AI paper in that wider context. At the Council of Europe level, you've already heard about the CAHAI committee, but there's also the work of CEPEJ and other committees, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that later. Given the number of initiatives that there are, we have been trying to keep up with this proliferation, and we have a list on our website of many of the different initiatives from the EU and beyond, which currently amounts to 260 odd, but is increasing all the time, and we do regular updates of that overview. While some of the recent activities do make explicit reference to fundamental rights, we have to also acknowledge that many of these initiatives prefer softer ethical frameworks, and we've heard a lot about ethics in the discussion so far here. It's, of course, quite attractive to focus on ethics. It has strong links to trust, which, again, we've heard a lot about, and trust of consumers in products. And it's seen as encouraging innovation and being supportive of business models to take full advantage of the single market. And, of course, against this backdrop, we know that there's a competition between what is happening at the European level and other developments in the US and China, for example. But from our perspective, we would be a bit wary of the use of ethics, at least in isolation, on the basis that they give connotations of voluntariness, that they're not enforceable by legal regimes, and that they're not necessarily standardized. So there might be sort of different ethical models that apply in different contexts. As a result, from the perspective of the Fundamental Rights Agency, we very strongly encourage the use of fundamental rights as a framework and a starting point for the evolution of any law and policy concerning AI. That's partly because, in contrast to ethics, human rights are legally binding instruments. Also that human rights put the clear responsibility on states, because it's states that have the ultimate responsibility for protecting and promoting human rights. Also because we have a great deal of experience in terms of using human rights to ensure protections and using that legal framework to support subsequent legislation, but also redress. And here, I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that human rights have already been used as a very useful framework in some related areas. So, for example, we can think of the guidance on business and human rights, and that some of those principles that have been established in that context can also be brought into the discussion around AI. And lastly, the advantage of a human rights-based approach is that it allows us to focus on the particular harm that is being done to individuals. And you see a reference to that also in the Commission's white paper. In terms briefly of some of our work on artificial intelligence, we're trying to support some of the policy processes that I mentioned earlier with evidence and advice that follows this fundamental rights-based approach. We've published 3 papers so far, the first of which was looking at discrimination in the context of automated decision-making, the second that was looking at the issue of data quality, both issues that we've heard quite a lot about in the last day, and most recently a paper on facial recognition technology, which is a particular use of artificial intelligence that can really cause quite significant fundamental rights concerns. These papers are part of a larger project on the use of artificial intelligence in EU member states, and the results of that work will be published at the end of this year. And the intention behind that research is to really be able to identify practical use cases of where AI is being used across different sectors in the economy, so whether that be employment, retail, insurance, the public sector, specifically law enforcement, etc., and to really understand the extent to which fundamental rights are part of the discussions when AI tools are being developed and deployed. Lastly, as I mentioned, we're also actively involved in some of the policy processes that are ongoing, both at the Commission level and the Council of Europe. The work that we've done so far really underlines the full range of fundamental rights that can be impacted by artificial intelligence and different related technologies. So we hear a lot in these discussions about data protection and privacy, and also increasingly about non-discrimination. And of course, both of those rights are extremely important in any such discussion. But it's also really important that we think of the full range of rights that can potentially be impacted. And really, it's hard to think of a right that can't potentially be impacted by artificial intelligence. So that includes freedom of expression, freedom of information, freedom of assembly, but also gender equality, the rights of particular groups in society, so the rights of the child, the rights of older persons, and the specific situations that might pertain to those groups. And I guess in the context also of ombuds organizations, it's particularly important to think of access to justice rights that are involved in any discussion of artificial intelligence, and also the right to good administration. It's also important to recognize that there's going to be questions around balancing of rights, and we heard some hints in that direction yesterday. So, for example, the question of the right to privacy and data protection and the right to non-discrimination. So if an algorithm is checked to see whether it discriminates against particular religious groups, then information on religious affiliation is going to need to be collected to determine whether that discrimination is taking place. So what does that mean for any potential future regulation of artificial intelligence? Now, our research suggests some elements that could be the sort of foundations for future law and policy. Here, the first thing to say, and I think our colleague from CAHAI also reflected on this, is that in Europe we already have a strong legal framework. So we have to acknowledge that we're not starting from zero, that there are already strong protections in place. The Charter of Fundamental Rights covers many different rights, which you saw in the slide before, that can be impacted. And of course, those are binding on the EU and member states when implementing union law. Also, we have the GDPR, and we have the existing equality directives. So, for example, if there were discriminatory outcomes in a recruitment tool using AI, then that would be illegal under EU law already. It's also really important to address the full range of rights affected. So we need to make sure that any discussion really looks to try to map the implications of any particular AI usage on the full range of rights. Thirdly, I think it's very important that we have concrete use cases about how AI is actually being deployed in practice. And that's partly because a lot of the discussion at the moment can often remain at quite a theoretical level, and we don't necessarily have the knowledge and information about some of the practical ways in which AI technologies are already being used. And in that respect, the session yesterday, I think, was really useful in terms of giving us a sense of some of the usages that are already in place. And this allows for a bit more of a contextualized discussion about fundamental rights implications of any use of AI. So, for example, in our recent report on facial recognition technology, we're highlighting that there's actually not one type of this technology, but it depends on how it's used, and the fundamental rights implications will change accordingly. So it's very different if facial recognition technology is used for verification purposes. So, for example, if you go through an automated passport gate at the airport versus identification, so one-to-many, which would be the usage in terms of live facial recognition, for example, for security purposes. Fourthly, the question of literacy for people involved in and affected by the use of artificial intelligence is particularly important. Often there's just not enough knowledge about the technology, about the way it might be used, and about the particular concerns that it might raise. But that literacy goes both ways. So it's a question of people from the technical side being more literate also of fundamental rights standards and concerns, as well as people coming from a fundamental rights perspective being better able to understand the technological elements. Lastly, it's also very important that we ensure cooperation across different areas and disciplines. Again, I think that's a point that we've heard in various different ways at this session, but really ensuring that we bring together these different voices is particularly important. And there perhaps also it's worth adding that as these technologies are increasingly rolled out, that hearing the voices of people who might have been negatively affected by decisions made by AI would be a particularly important part of that discussion. And finally, I just want to close by thinking of some aspects that it would be useful for ombuds organizations to consider as part of this discussion. It's interesting to note that in the Commission White Paper, it does highlight risks to fundamental rights as some of the most significant challenges that are posed by artificial intelligence, and that the white paper also highlights that there are very real risks that it would be more difficult to seek redress and to get compensation for victims relative to victims of harm caused by more traditional products and services. So one, of course, of the issues is whether people are actually aware that their data is being processed by AI tools. Of course, the right to effective remedy requires that you actually know what is happening, and that's not necessarily going to be the case. So thinking about how people can be more aware of how their data is being processed is particularly important. Secondly, we have heard about the challenges posed by the opacity of algorithms and automated decision-making, and that's, of course, linked also to questions of complexity. And again, the white paper addresses that in some detail, looking at not only whether we can actually understand what the algorithm is doing, but also whether we could, for example, be able to get and access the data that would be necessary to be able to build a case in the instance of harm being caused by an algorithm. Thirdly is the question of the allocation of responsibility, in that there are different fundamental rights that can arise at different stages in the process of designing and deploying and using algorithms. And it's really important to kind of think about what those risks might be and what that would mean ultimately for who might be responsible for harms that are caused. And there we see that this accompanying paper or report on liability from the Commission goes into that question in quite a lot of detail. And lastly is a question of scale and the number of people that are potentially affected by the use of algorithms. And I think, we heard a reference at the very beginning yesterday morning as someone saying the impact of the GDPR on resources for bodies that might be handling complaints related to the GDPR. And of course, given the scale of the application or potential application of AI technologies, having the resources to be able to ensure that people have redress is going to be particularly important. So my final call there would be that perhaps this and some of the other discussions that we've had can be some food for thought for ombuds organizations in terms of thinking about your contribution to the consultation on the Commission's white paper. We're going to certainly hear a lot, I'm sure, from business interests when it comes to this paper. And it would be really important also to get the perspective of national human rights bodies as part of that discussion, because I think you have very relevant experience and perspectives that really ought to be heard as a part of this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I were asked to write a headline, I would say that you are moderately optimistic about this human rights approach to the new European frame to minimize this problem, no? Which is the term that white paper put the stress on, minimize this problem of with rights.
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the white paper that fundamental rights were front and center in the discussion, and that's an extremely positive and very welcome development. I think also we could see that we are slowly moving away from a discussion that focuses only on a small number of rights, and slowly there is sort of more awareness of the full range of rights that can potentially be impacted. And again, we also saw this question of sort of harm and a harm-based approach being reflected in the white paper with the sort of different levels of risk that are identified and the sort of different processes that would need to be gone through to assess the risk of any particular use of AI, but in particular also identifying that there are uses in certain sectors or certain purposes which should always be considered high risk, in large part because of their potential human rights impact on individuals and wider society. So I think that is helping to integrate a fundamental rights-based approach. There, of course, it was also interesting to see what the Commission had to say about what it called remote biometric identification, which includes questions of live facial recognition technology, and in the white paper, the Commission is asking whether there are any circumstances in which that technology can legitimately be used, or whether the potential violations of fundamental rights are too great. And I think that is going to be a very important discussion going forward, given that we're seeing more and more examples of live facial recognition technology being employed. So the technology is there. So if we're going to try to stop the use of that technology on fundamental rights grounds, then there are going to have to be movements soon, because I think it is the situation is such that if such use is becomes commonplace, and it's much harder to regulate retroactively rather than to stop it before it becomes very common.
Ara passaríem la paraula a Geraldine Mattioli perquè ens expliqui el que farà la Comissió amb aquest tema.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here to present the work of the Commissioner for Human Rights on artificial intelligence and human rights. And for those of you who may not be very familiar with the Commissioner, it's actually an independent organ of the Council of Europe. Despite the title, she's not a member of the European Commission. It's important, it's a different organization. Her name is Dunja Mijatovic, and she took up her office in April 2018. My presentation will have two parts. First, I will present the recommendation that the Commissioner published last year and which was mentioned earlier by Mr. Strojin. And then I will zoom into the points that are included in this paper regarding the possible role of ombuds institutions and other national human rights bodies regarding artificial intelligence and human rights. So first, the recommendation. Since she started her office, Ms. Mijatovic identified artificial intelligence as one of her priorities. And the reason for that was that she saw very quickly that it will impact each and every of the human rights she is mandated to monitor and protect throughout the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. So it was very clear to her that this development will be fundamental in all of the work we do. Her approach was, it may indeed be necessary to have new regulations to identify the gaps, to look at new legal frameworks, but this is all going to take time, and in the meantime, the technology is being rolled out. So we need to start now, and we need to start with what we have. And let's not forget that human rights law, discrimination law, data protection law are very, very powerful tools which we already have and should leverage to ensure that artificial intelligence is deployed in a human rights compliant way. So the recommendation we published last summer, it's a very short document. I brought some copies. I encourage you to take some. It identified just 10 steps that national authorities should take to make sure that artificial intelligence is compliant with human rights. It's, if you wish, a human rights-based approach to using artificial intelligence. I'm not going to mention all of these 10 steps, it would be boring, but let me illustrate a few. If a public authority is thinking of using an algorithm along the lines of what we heard yesterday for social welfare benefits, facial recognition, police predicting, well, there are a number of things that should be done before they use this algorithm. One of which is, for example, the recommendation to develop human rights impact assessments. So if the activity is likely to have a possible impact on the human rights of the users, then the authorities should do this impact assessment beforehand. They should also repeat it once the algorithm is being used to make sure that no human rights violations are taking place. Another step in the recommendation is to inform the public, be transparent about the use of algorithm. What we heard, the examples we heard yesterday, the worst part is that most of the time people don't know that they are the subject of an automated decision. They don't know, they're never told that it's not a real person who actually reviewed their file for social welfare benefits. And this should not be the case. So transparency is very important. The authorities should and also have a positive obligation to encourage businesses to implement human rights standards when they are developing algorithms. It is the responsibility of the authorities to make sure that the businesses are keeping in mind human rights standards when developing these new systems. Another point that is mentioned in the recommendation is the need for oversight. We heard a lot about that yesterday. Keeping human oversight over these mechanisms is really important, and it should be independent from the businesses, from the authorities. How exactly to develop this oversight is a big question in front of us. How are we going to do this? And then, of course, Marta mentioned it a moment ago, developing AI literacy among the population is a strong responsibility that states have. So basically, this recommendation is a roadmap for national authorities to avoid that artificial intelligence is being deployed in a very wild, uncontrolled way. And the recommendation mentions national human rights structures by which we understand ombudsman institutions, but also national human rights institutions, equality bodies, data protection offices, all these bodies at the national level that have already now the mandate to control that human rights are respected. And we mentioned them in several places, so I'm going to present this to you, and I really look forward to your reactions and your thoughts about these possible roles for ombuds institutions. At the outset, I should say that we're very aware that ombudsman institutions can be very different, have different mandates depending on the countries. So of course, the possible functions would really depend on what they do in each of the different countries. But I would encourage you to think about the role of ombuds institutions in 4 broad different categories. First, what can you do to prevent human rights violations by artificial intelligence? What can you do to increase education of the public, sensitization of the public to these issues? What can you do in terms of oversight? And what can you do in terms of redress? And then for these categories, we see 2 types of activities, what I would call the classical ombuds activities, and then some maybe new things to consider, specifically about artificial intelligence. On the classical activities, I mean, these are really the things that ombuds institutions are doing every day in their role of controlling human rights, but just applied to artificial intelligence. So to make that concrete, reviewing legislation and policies. This is something ombuds institutions do all the time to make sure that legislations are human rights compliant. We've heard yesterday, there's a Charter of Digital Rights here in Barcelona, I believe. Was the Syndic consulted? Did we review that charter? That's an interesting question. Right now, many states are adopting strategies on artificial intelligence, new legislation. Make sure, you ombuds institutions, that you review these documents and make sure that they are human rights compliant. Launching a public information campaign could be another type of activity. Launching investigations in systemic violations that may be happening, publishing a report, publishing recommendations to your authorities would be another type of activity. And then, of course, dealing with individual complaints when they are going to come to you, that's the core of your job. Maybe providing legal assistance to victims, maybe conducting strategic litigation, because it may not be possible to deal with each and every complaint if there are thousands of them. So maybe strategic litigation will be the way to go. So this is obvious, but it's important because I think the work of ombuds institutions remains the same. If the human rights violation is committed by an algorithm or by a person, it's only the means that is different, but what's happening is the same, and what ombuds institutions should be doing about it is the same. And artificial intelligence, I think this has been made abundantly clear over the past 2 days. Artificial intelligence is not a science fiction concept, it's already here, it's already in our societies, it's already happening. So maybe one first step that we've heard happen in Sweden and Germany, for example, was that equality bodies there conducted a mapping exercise. So that was their first step, understanding what is being used in our countries, what are our public authorities doing. That can be a first step to get started in this work. In terms of possible specific roles, I will only mention 2 very briefly. This idea of human rights impact assessment. I think ombuds institutions have a lot of experience about how human rights violations happen. So maybe you can help the authorities design these impact assessments by preparing the questions that should be asked, what should be looked at, who should be consulted. Maybe you can even be involved in conducting these impact assessments. This is something to consider. The other point is this issue of independent oversight. In the recommendation, we were voluntarily very vague about what it could look like, because the question will be, do we need indeed a certification mechanism? Is that going to be a public institution or a private institution? Should different bodies be involved in this oversight, each bringing their own expertise? Or are we going to go towards a specific oversight mechanism like data protection offices, for example, for AI? So one, different from you. But then what does it mean for your specific competence in terms of human rights, and how do you make sure that it's being taken into consideration in this oversight? So that's another important function to reflect upon. I want to finish with some positive, 2 positive points. The first one is that at the Office of the Commissioner, we're actually very encouraged to see that ombuds institutions have already started working on this. You know, we heard Mr. Ribo and others saying, oh, we don't know anything, we're very ignorant. I think it's not true. There are really ombuds institutions that are leading the way and that are doing important work. I can give you some examples. In France, the French Defender has taken several cases regarding recruitment in universities, for example, or in the judicial system. In Finland, the Ombuds has done strategic litigation regarding age discrimination by algorithms. In Slovenia, also the Ombuds brought a constitutional case regarding automated license plate reading and privacy law. I had a discussion with Ms. Catherine de Brucker yesterday, who gave me several examples in Belgium where the Ombudsman is looking at automated decision-making processes. So there is a lot going on, and this conference is another demonstration that ombuds institutions are rising to the challenge. So that's very positive. The second positive I want to mention is to not forget the power of AI for human rights, not just against or the risk of violations, because AI will be able to help us to demonstrate instances of discriminations, for example, in a way that we were not maybe able to prove in the same way without AI. I want to mention one example. The Commission for National Human Rights in Ireland, for example, was able to use an AI system to analyze hate speech online on Twitter in the specific context of Ireland, and understanding where was the hate speech coming from, in a way that they would not have been able. They could have looked at Twitter for 15 days and not been able to analyze it in the same way. So there are really important potentials to keep in mind in your work about how AI can help you. The Commissioner is planning to continue the work. Our next step will probably be to try and look at specific use of AI in specific countries of the Council of Europe. We already did that in Estonia in 2018. You're welcome to look at the report. We looked specifically at the impact of AI on the human rights of older persons there. And we will continue. We had some preliminary missions to Sweden to look at social welfare, and Serbia, facial recognition. So I want to close by encouraging you to be in contact with us if there are cases in your countries, to raise our attention and to raise the Commissioner attention to this kind of situations. Thank you.
Gràcies, Geraldine. Hi havia aquesta idea que apuntava, que era utilitzar la intel·ligència artificial en la defensa dels drets fonamentals. És veritat, els mitjans també estem utilitzant, per exemple, en moderació de comentaris, certes paraules discriminatòries o malsonants també són eliminades pel nostre software. De totes maneres, aquesta aproximació optimista que ha fet al final el tema de la gestió de la intel·ligència artificial xoca una mica amb la idea de que La innovació tecnològica sempre ha anat molt pel davant, no?, de la capacitat dels governs de legislar, i ara aquesta innovació s'ha disparat d'una manera exponencial, mentre que els sistemes, els pressupostos, la gent disposada per aquesta oversight, per aquesta supervisió, és la mateixa de sempre, no? Vull dir, aquí hi ha un gap difícil de solucionar, no?
Yes, I mentioned Sweden just because I was there in January, and it struck me, indeed, this uncontrolled innovation and deployment of initiatives. There, it's municipalities that have started using algorithm to make decisions on social benefits. And clearly, the central government is not really following what was going on there, and the municipalities are taking the initiative of developing this. And so it shows that, yes, we need to catch up to make sure that this is being done in a way that is positive. And I strongly believe that there's positive potential in AI. We just need to make sure that it's done in the proper way.
Passaríem ara la paraula a la darrera intervenció, al senyor Peter Bonner, que com a representant amb aquesta taula de la institució de l'Ombudsman li han posat molts deures, no? Les dues conferències anteriors, preventives, de supervisió, educatives, de difusió. Bé, li dono la paraula.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and thanks for the invitation. It's an extremely interesting issue. The reading and the podcast listening I've been doing over the last 2 weeks has been some of the most interesting for a long time. We have heard a few times something about the creation of twins in relation to artificial intelligence and data, and I'm afraid that I might end up sounding a little bit like one of those twins, because so much has been said already. A few words about the European Ombudsman. The European Ombudsman is the ombudsman for the public administration of the European Union. And what is that? That is the institutions that we know from Brussels, the European Commission, the Parliament, the Council, and it is the vast number of agencies that we have all over Europe, specializing in different fields like fundamental rights, or which are involved in regulation on health and safety, safety of chemical products, safety of medical products, and so forth. The size of the European public administration is somewhere between 50 and 60,000 people. That is a fairly small number of persons for public administration for the European Union. It's a number of people that more or less corresponds to the number of public servants of a mid-sized European city. The reason for that, of course, is that we do not have very much direct administration. We do not have police officers. We don't have a European Commission hospital or anything like that. The European Union public administration is a regulatory machinery. Okay, and that's very important in this context. The European Ombudsman Office has around 80 staff. We are 25, 30 people involved in the day-to-day investigation work. We have so far not received complaints related to artificial intelligence. We do not have initiative in this field, and I think I am by now the most knowledgeable member of staff. So what am I doing here? I want just to flag two fields in which the European Ombudsman can be quite relevant in relation to artificial intelligence, and probably will be. You know that the European Union, although it is relatively small, has a lot of money. It's going to pour billions and billions into this field of artificial intelligence. Through this activity, there will be call for tenders, there will be call for proposals, there will be contracts, there will be consortia created consisting of sometimes 13, 15, 18 partners and so forth. Experience shows that there will be problems, there will be misunderstandings, there will be situations where the European Commission says to someone, no, you can't have your money because you haven't given us the deliverables, and then we have a crisis for a project. And these are the situations where the European Ombudsman can then come in and work as a can opener and help people through a bit of mediation or whatever. So that's just at a practical and relatively small level. Then the other thing to flag is that the current European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, who was re-elected for a 5-year period in December last year, has taken the approach of the office to a level that very much corresponds to the fact that the European public administration is a regulatory machinery. Okay? We cannot examine and look into legislation as such, but we can get rather close to the regulatory process. We've heard about ethics in AI. We are looking at ethics in regulation at the EU level. We're looking at whether there are situations of conflicts of interest in the regulation that is being prepared. We're looking even at whether there is an appropriate balance in, for instance, expert groups, workshops, conferences, that kind of thing. If people, they flag to us, listen, the European Commission is only inviting industry people to participate in this or that activity, then we can go and have a look at it. Okay? I think the first panel we saw yesterday was quite balanced. That was a good example of a balanced expert group on the issue. The Ombudsman has done so in a number of fields such as agriculture, really going in and checking who are members of these expert groups that are going to feed in to the policy process, which will ultimately lead to EU legislation. I have heard, and it's absolutely right, that there is so much good work being done at the Council of Europe, the Commissioner for Human Rights. The European Union has a very bad habit of stealing good ideas and then moving ahead like a bulldozer and turning it all into legislation. And it seems that this is what's going to happen right now. We have two very, very powerful and competent commissioners in Brussels in charge of this area of artificial intelligence, digitization, the whole digital strategy. And things are going to move very fast now. I can only re-emphasize, like my colleagues, that please do take the current opportunity of feeding into the policy process by replying or contributing to the public consultation organized by the European Commission. You just simply have to Google it, European Union public consultations, and you will find the list of open public consultations on artificial intelligence and on data strategy. It requires a little bit of homework, reading the two white papers in particular on artificial intelligence and data strategy. But feeding into this process is so important. It's not a box-ticking exercise. It's not just a formality. This is being taken really, really seriously. And it's part of the culture in Brussels. It's part of the culture at the European Union level to do public consultations. We even do them as Ombudsman Office. We've done several public consultations on different issues. And the interesting thing is to see that we get contributions from just about any sector. We get it from individuals, from researchers, but even from governments or from other EU institutions. So it's a really, really rich exercise that will influence what will be put in the legislation. Okay? One can even think of some of you getting together on an ad hoc basis and sitting down saying, why don't we together, researchers, civil society, why don't we make a contribution to this public consultation? Okay? Then I'd like to say one or two words. So this is just basically my own thoughts on what can, to bridge it to the next session, what kind of tools can we bring back? That is a very, very appropriate word for the next session and the title of the next session. What are the tools that we can bring back and start using as from tomorrow? I think the think tank presentation that we saw yesterday really hit the nail on its head in one of the slides which contained a reference to public procurement. It is true that we have a general mandate as Ombudsman. We can investigate a lot of things, but let's not forget the weaknesses that we also have. We cannot instruct the public administration to do something. We can only recommend, right? It's therefore very important for us to be in the field very early on in order to influence things. This is just a basic rule of negotiation, if you like. At the European Ombudsman Office, we do not have experts on artificial intelligence. And I think most public administrations in Europe will not have real experts on artificial intelligence. They will be employed by big companies, right? Salaries are better, opportunity for being creative will be better, etc. So there will be an issue of following the money. where will the money go? And there is an opportunity for ombudsmen right now to sit down, talk to the public administration and say, I want to know right now what you are planning to do. And I want to go and have a look at what you're going to put into the functional and technical specifications for the tenders that you are going to publish. And then taking the standards laid down by human rights and fundamental rights bodies, making sure that they go into the public tenders and that points are given to the companies that then reply to these public tenders. Is the level of transparency good? Is the testing at a very high level, etc., etc. So it's, to some extent, it's the old rule of follow the money trail when you want to do efficient investigations. Okay. Going back to the public consultation that is currently ongoing with the European Commission, one or two ideas about what one could consider proposing. We hear a lot about these days, a lot about things that went wrong somewhere and people knew about it. We know it from Dieselgate. We know it from the scandal that Boeing currently has, that people from the inside, they knew that things were not going well. I haven't seen in the white papers any high standard being set for whistleblowers for programmers, for instance. If there's a programmer somewhere who knows that this is going the wrong way, it might be a good idea for that person to have a good opportunity to go out and blow the whistle to the right body and with the right protective mechanisms. Okay? Then I can only reinforce what has already been said, that AI is simply something that is happening, but lots of the current standards, they apply to that. So again, going back with the toolbox, what would be a concrete action to take? One is to make sure that we either are internally absolutely fit for the purpose of checking equal opportunities, data protection, and so forth, or we have the right networks that we can access immediately. I would also like, as an ombudsman investigator, to be able to access a network of experts on AI if next week I get a complaint related to AI. I would love not to have to spend months looking for the right researcher and then do a public tender, then sign off on a contract to be able to draw on the know-how. I can see in Barcelona you are very privileged. You're surrounded by people who know what they're talking about. I, as an investigator at the European Ombudsman Office, I wouldn't really know whom to call if I had a case about AI. So creating networks that we can access immediately might be one very good idea. So that's all from the twin here. Thank you. Thank you.
Com que anem una mica justos de temps, si hi ha preguntes, passaríem el torn, i si no, jo us preguntaria, us demanaria, si el temps que triguem o que trigui la Comissió en tirar endavant una legislació, un marc europeu sobre intel·ligència artificial, hi ha el risc que els estats també vagin legislant, adaptant les seves legislacions al seu propi ritme i que això acabi creant aquesta fragmentació de mercat una mica perillosa per a la competitivitat de la pròpia Unió, de la pròpia Europa. Qui vulgui respondre. Algú vol respondre?
Okay.
I'm afraid this is broke.
Okay.
Yeah, I can answer briefly on that. I mean, two things, I think. I mean, the first is to say from the outset that I think it's a false distinction to separate out competitiveness and respect for fundamental rights as though they were opposing aspects. It is profoundly our view that the development of AI technologies that are fundamental right compliant are going to be better and more sustainable in the long run, and that we should view those two aspects as mutually complementary and as it's supporting the development of technology that reflects our values and the sort of society that we want to live in. So that's the first thing. Secondly, in terms of market fragmentation, of course, that has been sort of one of the cornerstones of the debate about regulation for quite some time, about whether you try to have horizontal standards that apply to all sectors or whether you would then have some particular rules that apply to particular sectors. I mean, it seems that there is some sort of coalescing around the approach of saying that you will have basic standards that cover all sectors and which may identify kind of particular risks and ways for assessing particular risk. But then given the sort of specificities that we see in different sectors and the kind of particular concerns, that you will then kind of complement that with more specific sort of technical regulations, as it were, that would apply to those different sectors. I mean, on that, I think it's also worth coming back to the point that I made in response to your question, which is that we need this element of context because it's not that the same issues are always going to be posed by the same piece of technology, for example. So, I mean, the different sectors in which the same technology is applied may raise different fundamental rights concerns, or at least different levels of potential harm caused to people. So it's very important when we're thinking about, I think, regulation, to think about the different purposes and the different contexts in which technology might be used, and the sensitivity of the potential decisions that might be made and the potential impact on people.
Donarem pas a la pregunta que ens ha arribat, que fa de referència a la protecció dels drets dels infants, dels nens i les nenes. Es parla de recol·lecció de dades, processament, opacitat, manca de seguretat, tot sobre les dades i l'ús que es pot fer per part de la intel·ligència artificial i el machine learning. Com s'articula això amb una protecció conscient i decidida dels drets de la infància? Quin és l'impacte dels algoritmes en els drets dels infants? Geraldine?
Yes, I'm afraid I can't have a direct answer to your question, but I know that this is one of the other topics where the Council of Europe is developing work. The very direct impact of artificial intelligence on children's rights, also in the field of health, for example. So I guess that's all I can say for now.
Maybe you.
I think it's always critical when you get to the stage and talking about your own family and children. It's not very professional. But yes, I do belong to the generation of parents who have tried to install protective apps on my children's smartphones and then with some pride see how they were hacking them all the time. We can talk a lot about regulation, rules and principles, but I think many of these solutions, they will be technical. At some point, someone will produce, perhaps with researchers, with medical experts, with pedagogues, with human rights institutions, some really, really efficient apps that we can download on our smartphones and thereby control the use of the data and the way people they interact, the way the children they interact with the digital world. It could really be that simple, but there needs to be a market for this.
Tenim alguna pregunta més? Doncs, si no arriba una pregunta, donaríem per acabar aquesta xerrada, aquesta taula, d'aquest workshop, i agraïm molt als nostres ponents la seva participació i les idees que han aportat sobre aquest futur moderadament optimista com a balanç d'aquest workshop. Gràcies. Thank you.